Thank you and welcome to Session 2 of Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology. Last time, we saw Bavinck detail a dialectical step from the old, pre-enlightened, religious ways of thinking to the new, Enlightenment, secular ways of thinking, as a part of the emergence of this new science, called psychology.
To describe the process at a high level, the psychologists created a new science of comparative religion and created a new method for classifying religious thought into genus and species. They accounted for the content of religious beliefs by surveying the religious populations, and they excluded the examination of a religion's doctrinal content from their scientific analysis.
So, rather than address the contents of religion, the new psychologists offered a dialectic step. They presupposed that the religious thought they were studying was atavistic, meaning that it was primitive, or a throwback to healthy ways of thinking, or vestigial. They considered that the religious mind corresponded to a child's mind in maturity. It was impressionable and gullible, a mind unable to come up with its own morality, understanding of reality, and high-level ideas, but instead was a mind that relied upon the external authority of parents, church, and society. In contrast, the new, enlightened, secular mind corresponds to a mature adulthood, a transition from childhood into new and mature adult passions, an understanding, with a new thirst for autonomy, and marked by independent critical thinking. It was a contrast between embracing a blind faith and science.
What has the movement become since Bavinck's day? Where has the new secular narrative developed, and how do non-believers today follow in the narrative footsteps of their enlightened predecessors? Recently, a movement called the New Atheism reflected the end of a general, society-wide goodwill towards Christianity in the West. There was very little content or arguments that was actually new to the New Atheism. However, while the anti-religious arguments were generally the same as secular arguments from previous generations, there was a difference in how those arguments were received during this new time. Arguably, prior to the year 2000, biblical literacy was at a high level, even amongst non-believers, and there was a general high level of respect for Christianity in society as a force for good. After 2000, there was a decrease in biblical literacy, a loss in goodwill, and a large increase of influential, non-Christian thought in society.
Why should this be? What can account for the dramatic transition in values? Well, one obvious factor is that massive moral failures among Christians, both individuals and institutions, made it easy for opponents of Christianity to demagogue, to paint in the worst possible light. It was easy to note that the worst moral failures in society were distributed as equally among Christians and churches as they were among any other groupings of people. What good was it to be a Christian if Christians had the same divorce rate, same incarceration rate, or participated the same as other groups regarding violent crime, financial wrongdoing, moral and intellectual hypergamy, or sex abuse scandals? The preponderance of behavior across the board was associated with Christian values, and institutions where these behaviors occurred fell into scorn and disrepute.
Further, even prior to this, members of Christian denominations showed the large tendency toward schism, and a warlike attitude toward other denominations not their own. Christians often treated fellow Christians the same way they treated non-believers, with a separatist hatred, a psychological accusation that those other Christians were ostracized from true Christian society, and outside the camp. If this was Christian love, the secular world saw no advantage to it, and did not want it.
There were also significant moral failures among Christian celebrities, especially those with television ministries, who ran their ministry as if the dollar was much more important than the cross. Also, significant moral failings appeared among very prominent television evangelists, including the worst vices that the evangelists had themselves preached against, and it's hard to overstate just how destructive the moral failings of public personalities were.
Also, due to the strong traditional component of Christianity, all of the warts and faults and failures from earlier societies came to be associated with Christianity. The detractors of religious thought evaluated that it was on the wrong side of history when it came to contemporary issues. The emergence of several waves of feminism, a stated regard for women's rights and treatment, a continuation of the fight for civil rights for Black Americans, a movement toward recognizing the social rights in the LGBT community, and an increase in social justice, in the Marxist sense, all challenged the traditional views and beliefs of Christians.
Finally, the old Enlightenment trope, or narrative, of science versus faith returned, and the virtue signaling of, we have science, you have faith, received a new life. The fruits and advances of legitimate science proved too difficult for aggressive partisans to resist, and any virtue associated with actual science was swept aside by overstatement and partisanship, as the use of science became nothing more than a trump card, a rhetorical device, used to advance the interests of one party against another.
It is worth noting that the old phrase, green wood does not burn, shows that unfortunately, demagogy generally has at least some grain of truth to it, that makes the step into overstatement seem so natural and easy. If Christians had lived up to the high ideals of their religion, it would have been difficult for partisans to successfully criticize them. Unfortunately, Christians lived instead in the same moral muck and filth, contra their own ideals, and appeared to the world as hypocrites.
However, on the other side, there was a tendency for the caustic skepticism, even if originally based around a grain of truth, to make a step into overstatement, a step that seemed natural and easy. The statement, "Some Christians live like hypocrites," intensified and escalated into a demagogy. The ideals of Christianity are a moral evil. For example, the truth that some Christians owned slaves transformed into the overstated accusation that the Bible teaches that slavery is a moral good. Skeptics looked at the descriptive biblical narratives and concluded that God is a moral monster, even if the prescriptive Christian ideals painted a different picture. Attacks against the truth of Christianity intensified at all levels. Sophisticated attacks from respected non-believing scholars intensified, and Christians were largely portrayed in cultural works like movies, sitcoms, and literary works as foolish and bumbling and inept, contrasted with the hip, exciting, cool, and fashionable skeptic.
This corresponded with a general fall of moral standards from earlier Judeo-Christian ideals. Restraint from vice, a high commitment to objective standards, ideals of fiduciary relationships, and opposition to hyper-aggressive partisanship, transitioned into the self-autonomy of Enlightenment thinkers, framed as self-sovereignty. The desire for one to do, as one pleased, was virtue, and to oppose it, was vice. The old labels of good and evil were removed. Much of what was formerly evil was now labeled as good, and the label evil became offensive in moral discussions with a secular right, unless, of course, one was talking about one's ideological opponents, in which case, evil was the right word to describe them. What an ugly partisanship.
For one example, among journalists, there was once a high and noble standard toward nonpartisan objectivity as an ideal in principle, even if it was not completely possible in practice. For example, the fall of one of the newspapers of record, the New York Times, from journalistic excellence into partisan pandering and yellow journalism, is a stark example. It was once an admired source for news, now its online version isn't worth the paper it's not printed on. In line with this general degradation, critics of Christianity and other religions routinely overplay legitimate concerns and have espoused a yellow journalism and a partisan demagogy that makes them unreliable critics.
Let's take a look at one specific example, a contemporary example, of hyper-aggressive partisan attacks, masquerading as reputable philosophy and science. Let's consider author James Lindsay's book, Everybody is Wrong About God. Lindsay works in a framework, common from the New Atheism period, in which religion is guilty by presupposition. The Enlightenment dialectic of the psychologists is used, in which religion is characterized as atavistic and immature, while secular thought is blessed as being virtuous, and noble, and mature. Let's read from the book's description.
With every argument for theism long since discredited, The result is that atheism has become little more than the noises reasonable people make in the presence of unjustified religious beliefs. Thus, engaging in debate with religious believers about the existence of God has become exactly the wrong way for non-believers to try to deal with the misguided, and often dangerous, belief in a higher power. The key is to stop that particular conversation